Delta Airlines using a hashtag in order to grab rights to use customers' images. What's this about?
It's essentially just a comment on how some brands can be quite sneaky and work around the rules. So I think a lot of people have this impression that they can upload their images to, Instagram, wherever, and they're still their images. What Delta's doing is they're basically asking customers to use particular hashtags, and there's certain, I guess, terms and conditions around those hashtags that will then waive any rights to the original user's ownership of those images. So it's kind of a sneaky way for Delta to be able to legally take those images and use user generated content for their own marketing purposes.
I'm willing to bet though that this hasn't been tested in a court of law. And
Yeah, I think it's one
like,
of those things like we discussed last week where, you end up with what was the conversation we were having about it? It was, the tech space not being regulated. I think
yes.
it's that same issue that we were discussing last week.
Yeah, like who has jurisdiction, who has control, because these, I mean, that's the benefit of, say, cryptocurrency in that no one can regulate it. But then when you're applying it more for, rather than a tool, more for something that can collect information about you and synthesize that information, how does that apply? And how does the consistency or the lack of consistency apply across the world? We're seeing at this stage companies having to essentially modify their service based on the country that you're in, like CNN leaving Facebook in Australia, which probably isn't a good long-term solution. It's easy when it's a big market like Australia, but you could imagine if smaller countries with very tiny populations started imposing their own legislation, that these companies will have a decision to make. And we've had, I'm not a fan of it, but we've had geo blocking of content for a while from streaming platforms. I wonder if we're going to get to a point where you can use XYZ functionality or feature, but only if you're using LinkedIn in this country, or you know in Facebook in a specific region, even, because I don't see why it couldn't become state based as well. In the US, you get that from a financial perspective and taxes, so why wouldn't that happen from a tech perspective as well? um, Not good though to be essentially quote unquote stealing, but I don't know how you can set rules or have ownership over a hashtag. I think that's probably the biggest gray area for me.
Mm-hmm.
Hashtags are a wonderful way to have a common thread around a campaign and get people sort of rallying around a campaign and get your community contributing as well. But user generated content in general is a bit of a gray area because yeah, I mean, there are platforms where you can very clearly license that sort of content, but at the same time, where do copyright laws fall? Where do they exist? Where do they stop? Many questions that um, are somewhat unanswered at this stage.